Almost every well-known aspect of or monument from ancient Egypt is in some way associated with pharaonic rule, from the pyramids, which were tombs for 4th dynasty rulers, to the royal cemetery in the Valley of the Kings. Yet many aspects of ancient Egyptian culture have prehistoric roots. Though this formative era obviously lacks any historical documentation, archaeologists have been able to uncover a fascinating amount of information about life and death in pre-dynastic Egypt. Before the 5th millennium BCE, the future deserts of Egypt received substantial amounts of rainfall, allowing for a great diversity of plant and animal species. However, climatic shifts gradually led to the low and high deserts becoming more arid, influencing nomadic groups to migrate closer to the river. The earliest agricultural communities of significance arose near the alluvial delta region, though the origins of domestication in Egypt are somewhat unclear. Several earlier cultures, like that of Nabta Playa, likely possessed domesticated cattle. However, the archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that the delta communities were in contact with peoples of the Levant, and the prevailing view among scholars is that trade or migration from this region gradually led to the adoption of agriculture in Lower Egypt. The so-called Fayum A culture arose near Lake Moiris, where no remnants of substantial dwellings have been found, though it is clear that this community cultivated and harvested emmer wheat and barley, alongside the raising of goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs. Fishing also provided an indispensable source of food. It should be noted that the lack of evidence for tents or huts does not imply that this area was merely the site of a seasonal encampment, as the presence of hippopotami required for the people of the Fayum A culture to stay and guard their crops year-round. They even possessed special stone arrowheads designed for warding off these predators. The succeeding Merimda culture is known from the site of Merimda Beni Salama, located alongside the Rosetta branch of the Nile. As seen with the preceding Fayum culture, such geographical positioning allowed for the exploitation not only of the wildlife within and near the Nile, but also of the fertile alluvial soil deposited by the river annually. The people of Merimda lived in oval huts of wood frame construction which were covered with hides. In the final stage of this settlement, the population reached approximately 5,000, and their seemingly primitive tents were aligned in rows forming streets, which some archaeologists point to as evidence for social organization. The earliest known representation of a human face from Egypt was found at Merimda. This small head has perforations on its forehead and chin, suggesting that some sort of material was placed in these holes, perhaps to represent hair and a beard. It possesses an almost eerie quality, looking back at us from the very origins of ancient Egypt. The next prehistoric culture we will discuss arose in Upper Egypt, following the decline of the Merimda culture. The Badarian period, named after the site of El Badari, marks the earliest attestation of agriculture in Upper Egypt. The first black-topped red ware appears as well, and it would remain in usage for hundreds of years afterward. The final period of pre-dynastic Egypt is known as the Naqada culture, divided into Naqada I, or Amratian, Naqada II, or Gurzian, and Naqada III, or the Proto-Dynastic period. Most of our knowledge of this era comes from a stretch of cemeteries near Naqada in Upper Egypt, but the settlement and shrine at Hierakonpolis has provided archaeologists with extremely valuable insights as well. Contemporary with the Naqada period was the Lower Egyptian culture, known from the sites of Tel el Farka and Madi in the Delta. Though this society is often neglected in favor of its Upper Egyptian cousin, many findings from the site have been spectacular, such as this 60-centimeter tall gold statuette with inlaid lapis lazuli eyes, probably representing a deity or ruler. Toward the end of the Naqada II period, the Lower Egyptian culture was subsumed into the Naqada culture. As stated earlier, agriculture and domestication likely arrived in Egypt through the Levant. The cultivation of wheat and barley spread throughout the valley, allowing for the production of bread and beer, which became staples in the ancient Egyptian diet and funeral offerings for the rest of its history. Domesticated cattle were introduced to these communities by pastoralists from the western desert. Along with sheep and goats, they provided the Egyptians with meat, milk, and raw materials for clothing. But they continued to fish in the river and hunt game in the desert for secondary sources of food. Although they were gradually abandoning the increasingly inhospitable high deserts, the Egyptians still visited occasionally, collecting minerals such as greywacke and gold, and inscribing rock art into the wadi walls. While early houses were made of wood and reed mats, those of the later Naqada period were constructed out of more stable, unbaked mud brick. Towns from this period are relatively difficult to locate, as they were built on the highest land in the floodplain, which is in many cases still occupied by Egyptians today. Moreover, the earliest pre-dynastic cultures simply buried their dead within the settlement, often under the floors of houses. They were wrapped in animal skins and usually without any grave goods. During the Badarian period, the deceased were buried in cemeteries separate from the settlement. They were laid to rest on their left sides facing westwards and with heads resting on rolled-up animal skins. Various grave goods accompanied the dead, the most common type being black-topped pottery vessels. Interestingly, scientific analysis of some Badarian remains have shown that embalming agents such as pine resins and plant oils were used on the dead in a simplified process of mummification which would peak some 3,000 years later. Graves in the Naqada I period were rather similar to those of the Badarian. However, the types of grave goods included were much more diverse, indicating social stratification. The first painted pottery appears in cemeteries from this period in the form of reddish-brown vases often decorated with animals and hunting scenes. Naqada II graves contain the first stone vessels in Egypt, and mace heads made from black or white diorite. Maces were a symbol of political and military power, and would appear in Pharaonic art for thousands of years to come. Although most of our knowledge of this period comes from cemeteries, there is one significant Naqada II settlement known as Nekhen by the Egyptians, and later as Hierakonpolis by the Greeks, meaning City of the Falcon. This was a fitting title, as the town was the cult center of the falcon god Horus from the pre-dynastic period all the way into Pharaonic times. There have been several notable finds here, one of the most interesting being the first painted tomb ever found in Egypt. This is referred to by archaeologists as Tomb 100, and contains scenes which would continue into Pharaonic Egyptian history, like the procession of funerary barks. The extravagance of this tomb means it was likely made for an elite member of Hierakonpolitan society. This grave isn't the only hint we have of an emerging dynastic culture. In a deposit of artifacts dating from the Naqada III, or Proto-Dynastic period, archaeologists found a palette showing on one side a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other side wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. At the top of both sides, the pharaoh's name is given as Narmer. Even for an artifact dating so far back in Egyptian history, this palette shows several elements characteristic of dynastic art, such as the smiting scene present on the reverse side of the palette, the registers dividing different scenes, and hieratic scaling, where the most important figures are made to be larger. Though modern scholars generally view the Narmer palette as a work of ceremonial art illustrating the triumph of order over chaos, rather than recording a specific historical event, it was around the time of this object's creation that Egypt first became a unified territorial state. Over the following millennia, this country would fracture and unify as the vagaries of time brought down rulers and dynasties and rose up others, but the strikingly consistent traditions of Egyptian culture, religion, and art have their roots deep in the prehistoric past.